Okay, welcome to History 264. Topic for today is patrilineal dissent and religious dissent. I'll introduce, they really don't need any introduction whatsoever for most people zooming in. But first is David Ellenson is Chancellor Emeritus and the I.H. and Anna Grensel Professor Emeritus of Jewish Religious Thought. Adam Ferziger holds the Samson Raphael Hirsch Chair at Bar-Ilan University, and it comes to mind right now that the two of you probably represent 40% of the lit review on my modern Jewish history comps. So thank you so much for joining. Dr. Ellenson is one of the pioneering scholars in particularly European and German Orthodox Judaism. Adam Ferziger began in Germany, but has since, and he still does, publish and teach quite a bit on that topic, but he has become really a leading figure in the history of American Orthodoxy. His sectarian Orthodox won a National Jewish Book Award a number of years ago, and it's an absolute pleasure, really, to be joined by experts in the field.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much. When you talked about Adam beginning in Germany and moving to America, I thought of Ma'alin B'Kodesh, Ba'ei Morigin, but as a European Jewish historian, maybe I shouldn't say that.
The truth is, what I should have noted is that back in the late 1970s, Dr. Ellenson published an article by Bernard Ilway, who was a 19th century American Orthodox figure. So he too, and a number of your work takes you across the pond into America.
I would just point out that I learned a great deal from David when I was in my PhD and early career, and in a way we became friendly when you were just about at that point, Zev. So, and David learned from my teacher, Jacob Katz, so there's a little bit of a shashalat here that's very nice that's going on, and happy to be a part of that as well.
So I'm beginning with this slide. I thought about sharing Look magazine, the Morgan essay, The Vanishing American Jew. I thought that was a little trite, but certainly in the 1960s, American Judaism is rife with discussion over assimilation, in particular intermarriage. And much of the discussion, even in that Morgan article, centered on the posturing of Reform Judaism in America. Two figures that I want to highlight for just a moment. One is Max Eichhorn, who himself advocates rabbinic oversight and performing mixed marriages. And he sets out on really a crusade in the late 1960s to come up with a list that's going to go public of which Reform rabbis are willing to perform mixed marriages in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And he's not trying to get anybody in trouble. To the contrary, what he's trying to do is make public that there are such champions of mixed marriage in Reform Judaism, and to really mainstream it in a certain way. On the other hand, you have a terrific letter, not necessarily for its content, but just for its historical substance, is from Professor Pedikowski, of course, who is a longtime professor at Hebrew Union College, and he writes to another figure in the Reform movement, Arthur, I think it's Lelyvald, excuse me. And he writes that now with Eichhorn and others, he feels like he has more in common. If you see the bottom of that first paragraph, I have more in common with Seymour Siegel of the conservative movement than with Albin Reines, more in common with the Lubavitcher Rebbe than with Sherwin Wein, the great leader of humanist Judaism. And so what hath Reform Judaism wrought, writes Jacob Pedikowski, and he writes several. This is a private correspondence that I found in the American Jewish Archives But he's quite public. And we'll see there's another source from Professor Pedakowski that we'll encounter a little bit on. But both privately and publicly, there are two minds within Reform Judaism. There are those who want to embrace the challenge, don't necessarily promote intermarriage as lechatchila, but when it appears, then rabbinic leadership should take it by the reins. On the other hand, you have others more on, these terms are quite loaded and freighted, but sometimes the best that we have, on the right flank of Reform Judaism, and Jacob Pedakowski is certainly on that side, and says, well, what is the meaning of Reform Judaism if we're going to accede to this vanishing American Jew complex? Did I get it right?
Yes. Are you inviting a comment at this point?
Comment, but as we switch to the slide, this is something that David, you had asked to reproduce, which is the person who really owns the moment within the Reform movement is Rabbi Alexander Schindler of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the URJ. Right. Were you at this speech?
No, I actually was not there when he delivered it at the Union. I was on the faculty of Hebrew Union College, and of course it reverberated not only throughout the movement, but even the whole United States, in the same way that Yeshiva College, and Zev, I know you've written on this, won the College Bowl. Alexander Schindler was actually featured on Saturday Night Live, and probably for this speech, and probably around that time, Schindler and the Lubavitcher Rebbe very well may have been the two most prominent rabbis in America vis-a-vis the larger public. But the fact that he was cited on Saturday Night Live says something about the cultural position he obtained. I mean, the one comment I'd make, you mentioned Max David Eichhorn. He was, though, still in a definite minority at that point. Yes. You know, the letter was from Bertram Korn, but what begins to happen is that with the 1970-69 population study that showed, as Rabbi Schindler says here, almost a 1/3 intermarriage rate. Keep in mind, if you have a 1/3 intermarriage rate, at least in the way in which sociologists counted, and Adam, you certainly can correct me, but it means you've got at least a 50% intermarriage rate for couples. In other words, one born Jew marries another born Jew. That's one couple. One born Jew marries a born non-Jew, another born Jew marries another born non-Jew. 2/3 of your families then are actually intermarried if you have a 1/3 intermarriage rate. So this is beginning for the first time to be common. As a sociologist, I would say that intermarriage, Jewish exogamy prior to the 60s would have been what sociologists call a deviant act in the American Jewish community. That is to say, no matter how liberal or universal the Reform movement was, Jews at that point, for a whole variety of reasons, married other Jewish people. Keep in mind, for there to be a high rate of intermarriage for a minority group, two things have to be true. The minority group has to be thoroughly assimilated or acculturated into the larger culture, but two, large numbers of people in the larger culture have to see members of that minority group as desirable marriage partners. So for a whole variety of reasons, it's not until the late 60s, 1970, that you begin to get a large number of intermarrieds. Schindler himself, who was German, and by the way, when you mentioned Pedakowski before, Pedakowski himself grew up as a young boy in the Hildesheimer school, Adasius Royal, in Berlin. He once even showed me a picture he had. At the age of 9, he won the Mishnayos contest for the Adasius Royal Day School. And there's a picture of him as a 9-year-old boy sitting on the lap of Alexander Altman, who was the rabbi of the community, the associate rabbi of the Das Yisrael synagogue at that point. Because of the Shoah, he left on one of the kinder transport, and he ended up coming to Hebrew Union College, but his own inclinations were always fairly traditional. But in 1970, Pedachowski certainly spoke for the overwhelming majority of Reform rabbis, and in 73, the Reform movement, the CCAR, did pass a resolution affirming that rabbis ought not to officiate at intermarriage.
But only about 100 rabbis signed that open letter that outed themselves as performing.
How many people did sign that letter?
About, I think, a shade under 100.
Yeah, so that's 100 out of, give or take. You would know probably better than me, but I'll say 800 to.
It's 800. 1 out of 8. Exactly right.
1 out of 8. It was definitely a minority position during that period. A great deal changed. And Schindler, who also was a German refugee to the United States, one of his own children had intermarried. The interesting point, and here I'll stop and let Adam or you continue, is that unlike Germany in the 19th century, and here I think of Yaakov Toury's book on 19th century, Toury, the Tel Aviv University historian, Yaakov points out in that book that in general, and of course there are exceptions, but in general in Germany, people intermarried and left the community. The issue in America is that people intermarried and still wanted to participate in the Jewish community as they understood it. So as a result, you had people like Rabbi Schindler, and he became the great leader for this. Schindler wanted to begin to affirm a patrilineal principle so that children of Jewish fathers and not just Jewish mothers raised Jewishly would be counted as Jews. And I have little doubt that his own biographical experience with his family and one of the daughters intermarrying may well have prompted him giving his attention to this issue.
You know, you mentioned the night you glossed over it, but it's an important point. Is the 1970 Jewish population study? Yes. It was the very first of its kind. It was replicated again in 1990, and then the ill-fated version in 2000. Pew Center has now taken over that task. But there is, and Lila Berman, our colleague, has pointed this out, is the attention paid by rabbis and lay leaders of all kinds in American Judaism to pay attention to social science.
Yeah, and here I do want to say that the interesting point is I did emphasize the biographical element about Rabbi Schindler, but the reality is it does have to be seen against this larger context. What was occurring in Schindler's family was not an isolated experience, but it was impacting over half the families in the non-Orthodox world during this period. So this study and this reality comes to be a very, very significant point.
And there's a lot of tension between Federation and rabbis. And this is also an attempt to leverage the social science and offer its own antidote to a challenge.
Yeah, I'll comment on that more later. I've been doing all the talking, so I'll let Adam or you, but I want to get back to the point about the role that social science plays in this whole discussion.
Adam?
I just maybe add a factor that you may have talked about in different classes, but this course is about American Orthodoxy and American Judaism. And I think it's always important, especially in a discussion like this about integration, intermarriage, et cetera, just to talk about how important it was to immigrant Jews to become American. Yeah. And you know, it's later, but I love that picture of Chelsea Clinton and Mark Wisvensky. And it's sort of as if this Yid's, you know, his parents were in Congress, but this Yid, Wisvensky, married Princess Diana or something. It's like, you know, there's something, it's to look at it as if Schindler, or certainly his constituency, would view intermarriage in and of itself as a completely negative thing. And what can you do? You know, they're doing something bad, but let's like sort of neutralize it, I think is underestimating
Right.
how big a draw it was to all Americans, including Orthodox Americans, and in different ways, to be accepted. And you know, here, just in terms of popular culture, the person who really put his finger on it real early was Woody Allen, Annie Hall. So not only sociologists, but popular culture is a great way to look at that sense of wanting to sort of be accepted, and the ambivalence about it. If I recall, this Schindler proposal and the whole development was after there was a TV show called Bridget Loves Bernie,
Right.
which was of course avant-garde, and that Hollywood was pushing something that wasn't necessarily the mainstream, but nonetheless, it's part of a conversation, and it's part of how people sort of, let's say, most groups are happy when the natives accept them. Jews were ambivalent. Just one more point. This conversation, not in the way that we're discussing it in terms of denominations, in terms of active policy, but the first talkie movie in history is The Jazz Singer, with Al Jolson, 1927. That movie is about a Chazan's son who falls in love with a woman named Mary, and he has to choose between singing on Yom Kippur and his love for Mary. So this trope of what is it? The relationship between marriage or romantic relationship and becoming American is very much ingrained in the 20th century trajectory of American Jews, and here we're seeing how it moves from that level into sort of creating ground rules for it. That's how I see this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I would even add to that. You know, I'm glad, Adam, that you mentioned the Bridget Loves Bernie, because I was thinking of that just a few years before. A deli owner's daughter marries this beautiful blonde goddess. But I was thinking even of Israel Zangwill's play, The Melting Pot, where you have, you know, someone who's a Russian Jewish woman or a descendant, an immigrant, ends up marrying someone whose father had been in charge of pogroms in Russia, killing the Jewish partner's ancestors. But America is going to be the fusion of all the races. So it could be, Zev, Dr. L, if you've done this in your class, but this trope goes all the way back to Israel too.
And
7, I think.
And not to pile on, but of course, you have Elizabeth Taylor.
Yes.
And you have Marilyn Monroe, both converting.
Right.
Just decades earlier. And especially with
I'm sorry. You know, the point that Rabbi Schindler makes at the end, we will dramatically increase the probability that the children of such marriages will be reared as Jews. Mordecai Kaplan in Judaism as a Civilization had already begun to speak about intermarriage, even when it wasn't common for Jews, and said that in the case of intermarriage, this becomes one of the real tests to see whose culture is the strongest, and the ability to raise these children Jewishly, where intermarriage occurs in Kaplan's prescient work, he said, is a test of the vitality of Jewish civilization.
And in fact, Reconstructionist Judaism had already permitted officiating already as early as 1968.
And maybe we'd add that one of the most, I think, for me at least, when I read it, the emotionally powerful moments in Kaplan's diaries is his description of his conversation with his granddaughter when she told him that she was dating a non-Jew, and his trying to sort of, just like you're talking about Schindler, where he really discusses his navigation of his ideals, his perception of Judaism with him being a grandfather, and how does he relate to his granddaughter, and those are lovely moments because I don't know. I wish I saw the students. I don't know who I'm speaking to, but lahavdil. When we study, I don't know if lahavdil is the word here, but when we study history of halakha, we always want to know not just who the rabbi is, but who's he speaking to, who asked the question, what's the circumstance? And the personal color here is part of the story. This is not just intellectual history. These are people who are living this and with their own families. And I think, you know, the sociology and NJPS is important, but I actually think it's communal rabbis who are dealing with their congregants who are a much stronger factor in all this, who are saying, you know, either I need to service my constituency, or my community is going to fall apart and it's not going to be financially viable if
And that is critical.
You know, which is critical because, you know, we're throwing out the baby with the baby, you know, with the bathwater, so to speak. But that's, all these things are part of this. And I actually think much more than whether, you know, the percentages and the statistic is what goes into the newspaper. But I think when you see a letter from 100 rabbis, that's more about what they're experiencing grassroots on their congregational level. And I think the fact that I think all three of us have served as rabbis in different capacities within congregations, or even as guests, or at some point, I don't know about you, Zev, but I was a rabbi.
Rabbinic intern is my highest station.
It's given me a lot of insight as a scholar as to that experience and the push and pull between authority and leadership and formal law and trying to find that and whether one agrees theologically or not, you see that within the whole contours of this discussion here within the Reform movement.
And so Schindler, oh, go ahead.
No, just to reinforce Adam's point, I was thinking of a parallel in Germany. David Zvi Hoffman, the head of the Rabbiner seminar there, in Melamed Lahoyle, I think it's Yoredea number 85, in dealing in a case where it's clear that the person about to convert, chas v'shalom, I am not attempting to say that David Zvi Hoffman would have affirmed patrilineal descent. Do not misunderstand what I'm about to say here, but the point that Rabbi Ferziger just made about what it means to have personal relationships, the question here was, can you in fact perform a conversion when it's probably unlikely that the person's going to be shomer mitzvot? And one of the lines that Rabbi Hoffman uses in his tshuva to this, he does permit the conversion. I mean, you'd have to look at the whole tshuva, but he says, "Kadei le'achos hara b'miuto," in order to keep the evil to a minimum. In other words, he's not happy with performing this conversion, but he thinks because of the issue of constituency retention, better to do the conversion, have an Orthodox rabbi officiate, get as many promises as you can. In fact, he says, you know, take a havtacha bimkom shvu'ah. Don't make anybody swear anything. Just have them say they'll be observant, but don't check too closely. Danny Gordis wrote an article about this in Modern Judaism, and it's all about constituency retention. But part of that does grow up out of, I think, economic concerns, but I think in addition, just what does it mean to have known a child, let's say from the day he or she was born, they've gone through their bar, bat mitzvah, education with you, and now they're suddenly coming to be married. There is a human tendency to want to accommodate. On the other hand, there are many people who might choose not to, but I just think the human element in this is not insignificant.
Unquestionably. So in December 1978, an audience is absolutely important. Schindler delivers this keynote speech to the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, so its board of trustees, but what it really sets in motion is a task force assembled by the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the rabbinical arm, which Schindler is a member, but he's not the head. But again, he is the most powerful individual within the Reform movement. And these are fluid organizations. They are all dispatched by the same very well-organized movement. And he sets forward, and when they begin to consider the question, and Adam's point is well taken, is that one has to zoom out to American religion writ large and Americanization. So on one hand, the Catholics double down on absolutely no to intermarriage, whereas liberal Christianity is starting to reformulate their borderlines. So Reform Judaism, as a religious actor in the American religious scene, is exercising its right to consider its options like other liberal American faiths.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what you said, Zev, is that you cannot overemphasize enough the major role that Schindler occupied in the Reform rabbinate. As head of the UAHC at that point, he was the head of the Reform movement. And even though he didn't occupy an official post within the Central Conference of the American Rabbis, one cannot overemphasize how significant his stance was in influencing Reform colleagues and the conference itself.
Oh, don't disagree whatsoever. My point is that here he's talking to many lay leaders in Houston, and it's actually a testament to his authority. This question of religious and lay authority over here is that he is essentially directing the rabbinical arm, even though he's really the lay arm, a rabbi himself, of course. And it's only, my point is just how larger than life he actually is.
By the way, I know someone who wrote on this issue in the 19th century in America about rabbinic lay authority and issues of that regard. So you might want to look at Zev Elif's book on that.
Yeah. In the 1982 CCAR convention, where Schindler really anticipated that this would really be the moment in which he wins the day. And just to understand, I think we're all initiated, everybody logging in is that traditional Judaism accepts matrilineal descent. That is to say that one is Jewish de facto. If their mother is Jewish too, they do not need to affirm Judaism afterward. That's a really important point. And even when the father is not Jewish, but the mother is, that baby is still Jewish. And what Schindler has set into motion is for the possibility of patrilineal descent, but that's not really, it's almost unfortunate, and I've written a small chapter about this, that it's titled patrilineal descent. What Schindler actually preferred was non-lineal descent.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I agree with you. You stated it exactly right.
But in 1982, he didn't have the votes whatsoever. Here you see a CCAR member, Rabbi Sheldon Zimmerman, referring to the committee and their proposal for patrilineal descent. If you look in the very first text, this conference must never, in principle or in name, never go on record with that kind of statement. The amendment is basically against the Jewish people. Mr. Chairman, Jewish people, peoplehood, invoking Kaplan.
Yeah, by the way, Zimmerman, as I'm sure many of you know, was my predecessor as president of the Hebrew Union College. He himself grew up in an Orthodox background in Toronto and ended up coming to Hebrew Union College. But you can see the strong sense of Jewish peoplehood that informs Rabbi Zimmerman in that declaration.
And in terms of the proposal that's on the floor, is not just, again, to refer to what I was saying just a moment earlier, it's not just to affirm that somebody is Jewish because either their father or mother, but they have to take on, what is the language, certain performances. That it's not, and if you look at in the second text by another CCAR member, when they participate in Jewish life. They need to affirm their Jewishness, not just based on whether or not their parent is Jewish. And this gets into a whole question of status and identity.
Yeah.
Which is that somebody's status as a Jew was predicated, according to traditional Jewish law, on whether one's mother was Jewish. Schindler was very fond of saying is that there are certain communist leaders who would be Jewish by virtue of the fact that their mother was Jewish, but David Ben-Gurion, the king of the Jews, would have, in fact, a non-Jewish grandchild, even though that child presumably would have participated in Jewish life. And so what Schindler and what the Patrilineal Dissent proponents, its champions, are trying to do here is merge status and identity. It didn't matter one's Jewish status according to traditional Jewish law, how one identified. Now, the coalescence is key. Identity helps make status.
Yeah. Let Adam go first, and then I'll make a comment.
Well, where maybe this is for later, but I think that the use of identity is so complicated here. I would add the word religious identity, because this whole discussion emerges out of a sense that these people feel that they're Jewish. So they have a Jewish identity. And then the question is, do they get the official approval of a religious framework? And again, as we heard, the Reconstructionists have already accepted them. So, and I'm saying this even sort of to telegraph to the Orthodox, because there's sort of a ripple, whereas the Jewish identity moves from being sociological to being religious, but not Orthodox, but Reform and then conservative. Then you're all the time you're narrowing the level at which they're not Jewish. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's sort of just to go back. I mentioned our teacher Jacob Katz. He really emphasized the role of adjudicators as putting into formal law things that the tzibur, that the kahal, the people, the grassroots are already kind of doing, and how often you have that in his book on the Sabbath, Gentile, Goy Shabbat. It's very clear. He talked about the ritual instinct. So that's something that's kind of complicated in the Orthodox world because of a certain understanding of halakha, but it's the way law works, common law to formal law. So I when I look at their debates, and there are people on both sides, but in the end of the day, what this is deciding if there's enough of a wellspring, is it called? Are there enough people who are just doing this that either the UHAC gives it some sort of official status, or they become irrelevant, or something in between. So I think that this is crucial in terms of Reform relationships with other denominations. I think
Sure.
It's ratifying an internal moment which took place or was in the process much prior.
Right, just an addendum is, if you look at the portion I quoted in the second box, does it mean going to the Y or joining a Zionist organization? Exactly right. We're talking about religious identity. If one offers a donation to their local federation, he was being facetious.
And that's a little bit like playing on Kaplan, JCC, and where he actually says, "Of course you're Jewish," in a sort of Achad Ha'amism in the diaspora. If someone goes to the JCC or collects stamps, then they're very Jewish. So here, Reform, which is more parochial in its sort of orientation, is playing on that. But okay.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points. At this juncture, Schindler is quite confident. While I was not at the UAAC convention in Houston in '78, I was present for a talk that Rabbi Schindler gave probably in '80 or '81 at Sinai Temple, a conservative synagogue in Los Angeles, where probably more than 2,000 people were present. And Schindler proclaimed, basically, we are the Jewish people. Namely, Schindler felt confident that he represented the majority of Jews in the United States at this point. And he spoke from that position, you could either say of strength or arrogance, but that is definitely how Schindler felt at that juncture. The other point I'd make about status and identity, and here one has to consider the whole reality of what has happened in modernity. Status, as Rabbi Elif pointed out, is kind of a legal position. In other words, is one a citizen or not a citizen of, let's say, for example, the United States, whereas identity often is a question of how do people view themselves. Part of what modernity did was that there are different circles, one could say, between status and identity. And in the Middle Ages, when you did not have a voluntaristic political entity, and where Jews were, to be a Jew was, one's status was defined by one's Jewishness in a non-voluntaristic community where Jews were, and the community semi-autonomous. The difference between how individuals viewed themselves, how they were viewed by the non-Jewish world, and how they were viewed by the community, there was virtually no dissonance whatsoever. In modernity, take the example of Ben-Gurion's granddaughter. Ben-Gurion's son married a Scottish woman who was converted by a non-Orthodox rabbi with mikvah to Judaism. The family comes back to Israel. Israel has no problem with them living there. And Ben-Gurion's granddaughter grows up as a secular Jew in the state of Israel, both in Tel Aviv and at Sde Boker, but mostly in Tel Aviv. Her father is Amos Ben-Gurion. She serves in the Israeli army. She speaks Hebrew. Now you'd have to ask yourself, how does she view herself? She grows up in Israel. She speaks Hebrew. She's friendly with secular Jews in Israel. Her grandfather is the Rosh Memshalah, the prime minister of the Jewish state. She serves in Sahal, speaks Hebrew. She views herself as a Jew. Reform and conservative Judaisms would also view her as a Jew. Her mother, after all, was converted with mikvah. Most non-Jews meeting Ben-Gurion's granddaughter, who's an Israeli, would also think of her as being a Jew. But from the standpoint of orthodoxy, simply because by and large, conversions conducted by Orthodox rabbis, by non-Orthodox rabbis, including conservative ones, as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein puts it, pashut, enam klum. I mean, they have no legal status whatsoever. But that's where the complication between status and identity emerges. And you do have Orthodox rabbis, even in Israel, dealing with Russian, and I put this in quotation marks, Jews, namely children who are descended from Russian Jewish fathers, non-Jewish mothers, who come live as secular Jews in Israel, serve in the Israeli army. Are they Jewish or not? So that you have a rabbi like Chaim Amsalem, the former Shas member of Knesset, who writes 2 volumes on Zera Kodesh, he calls it. He says, Zera Yisrael or Zera Kodesh? I forget the term he uses.
Zera Yisrael.
I wrote an article on it once, but I forget the term at this moment. But in other words, he's not willing to call them fully Jewish, but he's not willing to call them, well, they aren't Jewish. If you only look at it in a bifurcated way, but there is a social cultural reality where they are Jews, and that is part of the dilemma that arises in the modern world.
Yeah.
If I may, just 2 things that Professor Ellenson just raised that or Rabbi Ellenson, I'm very happy to call him Rabbi Ellenson.
You can call me David.
Or David is what I usually call him. I'd be very interested, and I don't know where, Dr. Elif, where you want to take this. If you think, it's a kind of a binary question, but you could take where you want. Did this patrilineal dissent decision save Reform Judaism as a movement? from a movement perspective, was it the key to the fact that reform is been able to sustain its numbers to a certain degree, certainly much more successfully than conservative Judaism that kind of waffled this? That's a question that I would like to ask Dr. Ellenson. The Israel issue that maybe I'll throw it at you as well is that I think there's some sources here later on, which is that the Israeli reform movement hasn't accepted patrilineal descent. So
Here's
the
Moses
flip side
Cyrus
of social
Wheeler.
status
Yeah.
is the fact that the geography actually has a big a role to play in the so-called religious legal understanding here. So is that okay that I threw
Sure. In fact, you anticipated the text which you had wanted in the next slide that I have up right here, which is the leader of Maram of Israeli reform. Saying, well, what about us? And I think what both of you are pointing toward is that Jewish identity is very complicated. It's entangled with all sorts of different identities in Israel. In fact, you could be a secular Israeli is still a Jewish identity. And so one of the few antagonists of patrilineal descent, when the decision is finally made overwhelmingly in favor of patrilineal descent in Los Angeles in March 1983, is one of the leaders of reform in Israel, saying, well, what about status in Israel? Don't you realize what you're about to do to us?
Well, can I just add one more piece to that? That, of course, this all came 10 years after, because of the first wave of Russian-speaking Aliyah, there was an amendment to the law of return in Israel, and they actually were the first ones to recognize patrilineal descent from a legal perspective, and actually grant patrilineal descent, because they amended the law to say that if a person had one Jewish grandparent, that was sufficient in order to gain a certain type of Israeli Jewish identity, not a religious one. And the Rabbanut, of course, didn't feel obligated by this, and that's a debate till today. But ironically, you have a situation where Israel has actually proceeded in terms of giving a legislation that allows for a certain formal status of Judaism to people who are not halachically Jewish according to any denomination, while the Israeli reform movement is saying, as Israelis, we still have to have some sort of relationship with the religious milieu and the ambience that is prevailing here, and therefore we're not comfortable with following suit. And this again goes back to that Americanization issue, which is part of this. But
but it also goes back to Jewish peoplehood, right? Is that in a post-67 world, this echoes the comment in 1982 that this is a disservice to the Jewish people. That what he's pointing out is all of you people squarely focused on Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, maybe a few out-of-town places besides. Well, what about Jewish peoplehood? Israel is starting to claim, at this point, America is still the largest community in the world, but Israel is the all-powerful arbiter of so much within global Jewish life and Jewish peoplehood.
Yeah, although as Adam pointed out, the Chok HaShvut and its amendment, part of the motivation, I think, for the amendment to the law of return in 1970 was actually what had occurred in Poland after the Six-Day War, namely, and I just read an article by Nathaniel Fisher where he discusses elements of this, but one of the things that did occur was post-1967, there were not large numbers, but of the Jews who remained in Poland, or at least even those who were patrilineally descended, they actually were discriminated against as Jews in Poland after the Six-Day War. And therefore the Knesset, part of the purpose of Chok HaShvut, the law of return, was to see to it that no one, that no Jew would ever again not have a land of refuge. Consequently, for a secular law like the law of return, it is interesting, Adam, as you pointed out, this Jewish status in a secular sense is granted to people who halakhically would not be. What you do see with Rabbi Weiler and others, Rabbi Zimmerman and the other quotes, is that there still were significant numbers of persons within the Reform movement who did see traditional definitions of Jewish peoplehood as still being dominant, or that they ought to still be dominant and determinative in Jewish circles. Pedagogsky himself, in Moment magazine in '83, wrote an essay opposite of Rabbi Zimmerman, where he was unbelievably critical, and his contention was that by passing this resolution, the Reform movement had opted out of Jewish peoplehood. Having said that, just to answer your question quickly, here is how I would respond to what you had asked, Adam. I don't think that the motivation for this passage of the resolution was to assure the ongoing numerical strength of the Reform movement. I think it was honestly a response to all the other factors that we talked about at the beginning here, namely both the personal and the sociological factors of attempting to desire to keep people within the Jewish fold. There was an inclusive thrust on the part of the leadership and ultimately the membership of the CCAR. But having said that, when you asked what was its impact, so in 1992, 42% of Jews surveyed in the United States in that population study claimed they were conservative, 40% claimed they were Reform. In the Pew study, and again, you can correct me, 40% of all the Jews interviewed claimed they were Reform. Keep in mind, this is how people answer a survey. Doesn't mean they all belong to a Reform movement, synagogue, or temple, but 40% said they did, and only 18% contended that they were conservative Jews. So the answer I give to your question, Adam, is whether it was intended or not, and that would require an historian like our friend Zev Elif and you to go through and look at all the documents. The impact of it was that with a 70 and 80% intermarriage rate that the Pew study indicates, we have among Reform and conservative Jews in America, the Reform movement, inasmuch as it is the most lenient in relationship to intermarriage and inclusive of the children of intermarriages as persons possessed of Jewish status, it undoubtedly has played an overwhelmingly significant role in the relative strength of Reform, even in 2020. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. Whether that's intent, I'm not sure.
And here is the resolution finally decided in Los Angeles in 1983. And there are two different parts to it, just to highlight. And here's basically the full text. Number one is the chazaka, which is the presumption of Jewish status, whether or not it's the father or the mother or both who claim Jewish status. But of course, that has to be proven. It's only a chazaka, it's only a presumption. But, and it's interesting, and we don't have time to go through this here, but there's a whole halachic literature that comes out, and a historical one with Shaya Cohn's research about Jewish status that happens beforehand. So it's not just a sociological survey. There's really deep learning that goes into formulating this decision. And then you have that second paragraph, a discrete list of Jewish activities, which counts for the performance, which elevate the presumption into full-fledged status.
Yeah.
And here, I absolutely love these quotes because, and when this gets to, and I do want to get to it, is the response of the Orthodox.
Can I just say, Zev,
please.
One thing, I think it's, once again, a lot of the really fascinating material, and this might be interesting for some of your students looking at that if they have to do research papers, is to go through the CCAR responsa that come since 1983 and how these things are, to what degree they're really enforced, all sorts of situations which were not predicted, and in as much as people who are Orthodox don't really understand how a movement that doesn't believe in obligatory halakha could have halachic responsa, there's a whole literature of discussions, and so much of and it's all online, of the CCAR responsa literature since 1983 has had to do with this issue of how one interprets patrilineal identity regarding bar mitzvahs, weddings, etc., etc. I'm sorry.
The Journal of Reformed, and I was referring to the once erstwhile Journal of Judaism, which comes out with a whole issue dedicated to the earlier response on the matter, and Solomon Freehoff, who has a relatively new biography out, he responds to it, and absolutely, and the question is that dissonance between rabbinic proclamation and lived religion is something, Adam, that you've really pushed forward on the scholarly agenda. And two of these texts, which really anticipate the Orthodox response, one is by Jerome Molino. What are we uneasy about? He's stating this from the floor in 1983. Being machmirim, meaning referring to the fact that they have to do Jewish, not to claim status. We have been condemned over and over because we have taken the easy way out, or have seemed to take the easy way out. If there is a suffix, so he's using halachic language. If there is a suffix about the Jewishness of a child who has one non-Jewish parent, then it applies equally, and the suffix has to be resolved. And Alexander Schindler, and this is what I was referring to a while ago, let me give you a dramatic case in point. Traditional Judaism denies the Jewishness of Ben Gurion's grandson because his mother was converted to Judaism by a Reform rabbi, yet it accords Jewishness to a grandchild in the heat of the Cold War, of course, of Khrushchev, because the mother, Khrushchev's daughter-in-law, was a Jewess. So really also, he's taking on Ronald Reagan. Yeah.
You know, this is just an anecdote that may be of no import at all. I was a rabbi in Port Washington, New York at Community Synagogue, and one of the members of our congregation wanted to marry a young woman who had been raised Christian. And it turned out that her mother and her grandmother matrilineally were Jewish. And the question came to be, would we in fact perform the marriage? Because at this point, we were not performing intermarriages. Would we perform the marriage of this young man in our congregation with his fiance? And the senior rabbi in the congregation and I were in the midst of discussing it, when ironically, what we had come to decide was that this young woman would have to undertake the same course of study that a convert normally would have undertaken. And we would then have had a ceremony with a mikveh, and we would have done we would have then performed the marriage. Ironically, she went to an Orthodox rabbi, or the couple did, in a neighboring town. I won't give the identity. And this rabbi just performed the marriage because in terms of status, she did have a status definition as a Jew, despite the fact that she'd been raised as a Christian. I mean, this has to be an unbelievably unusual anecdote, but it did occur.
But it betokens exactly this issue.
It's exactly this issue.
Fascinating.
That is a wonderful story, David. It was worth it to participate just to hear the story. But it's not the first time. I remember you once told me that you puzzled the ketubah that was written by Orthodox rabbi from a certain sect person. So you're a machmir, and you know, I always tell people not to ask you shilas because they're going to get a chumrah, and here we go again. So
here, and already what Reform Judaism is anticipating, and something that Adam's written quite a bit about, actually in this context of Orthodox reaction to Reform, is Orthodox triumphalism. Already in 1959, Herman Wouk has published a New York Times bestseller. It actually reaches #2 on the list, sells 200,000 copies in its first month, is This Is My God, in which he is rather unkind to conservative reform. He's called out for it. The reviewers call it Woke's God, not This Is My God. But in Moment magazine, an interviewer who identifies as Reform, this is in 1979, so really in the thick of our discussion, I don't want to be on trial here. This is the bottom quotation. The question is how you feel about Reform Jews like me. I don't feel about you, the Orthodox Jewish woman responds. I don't even think about you. I hate to be mean, but when I stop to think about it, this is a modern Orthodox Jew in Brookline, Massachusetts, sends her daughters to Maimonides in Brookline, just so we have an understanding of this. I say you must have a hell of a problem. I've got it made. And when I look at our Orthodox community, she's a member of the Young Israel Brookline at that time. In Brookline, I see that we haven't yet lost, remember, this is the measure of success. We haven't yet lost one person. Not one kid has rebelled or opted out. And here you have, again, the Reform Judaism's diminishing boundaries, saying this is only going to empower Orthodox Judaism in its fight against Reform Judaism. Two important articles from the Journal of Reform Judaism. And then just as that they had prophesied, here are two examples, but I could have drawn from a whole bevy of sources. First, this is fascinating. Also in the American Jewish Right, it was actually restricted until I asked for it. A number of years ago. This is in January '84. It's the Agudas Ha-Rabbonim, which is not exactly in its most prominent epic in its own history. They are asking in the name of hundreds of learned, is actually written in Hebrew and in English, venerable rabbis who are steadily engaged in the struggle to preserve the sacredness of the Jewish family. And really that's what's so interesting, is that this is not about rabbis, supposedly, this is about families. And here you have, in the last paragraph, the burden of guilt for this, in the second to last paragraph. Should you, God forbid, not repudiate it, referring to the Patrilineal decision, we will be forced to promulgate a halachic prohibition for Jews to marry members of your communities and congregate as if they were encouraging it in the first place. The burden of guilt for this harsh but unavoidable step will be upon you forever. He's writing this to Gunther Plaut at this moment. While the people of Israel and the Beit Din, this is their Beit Din, the Agudas Ha-Rabbonim, will be innocent before God. And here on the right, you have an open letter to American Reform Jews. Please tell your rabbis to tell them that the genie is not yet out of the bottle. There's still time to move back in the other direction.
It's interesting, as Zev and David know well, I was interested in how quickly or within a decade or so the discourse changed. That was the part, or maybe a decade and a half, and how quickly people changed their voices. But this is especially when it comes from Agudas Ha-Rabbonim. There's another book that we all know called The Coming Cataclysm by Ruben Balka. And to me, that's actually more significant. Ruben Balka was a modern Orthodox rabbi who was dealing with, who was a rabbi of a community that probably had a very diverse congregation. It's here. And he's worried. In other words, if you're a rabbi in a very homogeneous community, then you care, let's give the benefit of the doubt, you care about Klal Yisrael, and there's something very, very dramatic going on here in the decision, the jura decision to recognize patrilineal descent. But there's also the part that, most Orthodox congregations up until the 60s were not primarily occupied by observant Jews. And Orthodox rabbis served a very diverse constituency. So this is not just about politics. This is also about, Chicago is such a wonderful place to study these kinds of things, as you, Zev, know so well, in terms of traditional Judaism and all these sort of hybrid type of frameworks. And so this is boundary defining, but I think when the more, I guess, Haredi people do it, it's sort of it's a type of protest literature. When Bulka does it, it's a little bit of there's a sort of sadness in it. He's not just being combatant; he's being sad because, in principle, he's a guy who actually does want to engage, and part of his mandate is in a sort of yeshiva. I don't know if he went to YU, but he's sort of,
I think he did. Yes,
RCA world. So there's a sadness. So I think we it's important to differentiate between those two.
There are people who are trying to enforce borderlines and their red lines, and other people who are dealing with a breed of what they used to call non-observant Orthodox Jews.
And certainly when Jonathan Sachs says, he says, Anus al pia dibur, the quote that you bring here, reform policies increase the likelihood that sometime Orthodoxy will see reform as it saw Christianity as a separate religion. Now, that's a kind of strong statement that maybe will shock people. But Jonathan Sachs is not a person who's looking to create boundaries. He's actually looking for conversation. It's just when he wrote his book about renewing covenant and stuff. So here, One People, that was the book that he wrote, which was really about this issue where he looked at it a little bit historically. So I think that the Orthodox reaction in the early stage is not acceptance by any means, but I would say we should distinguish between two different paths in terms of these statements, and the background of the people is important here.
Yeah, I think the other point is that here I do think of our teacher, Yaakov Katz, in his book, Out of the Ghetto, in his chapter, Conservatives in a Quandary. Conservatives here mean ultra-Orthodox Jews in Central Europe during the 19th century. And there's a large literature, Professor Katz points out, where in the 1840s, one way in which the ultra-Orthodox, those particularly in Hungarian yeshivot, who were the heirs of the Khatam Sofer, there is some literature saying we should just say that Reform Jews are not Jews, but the quandary, as Professor Katz pointed out, into which they're held is that they were also wedded to halakha. And from the standpoint of halakha, as we've said over and over again, the text in Kiddushin makes it clear, Yisrael af al pi shechata, Yisraelhu, namely there is a birth dogma in Judaism, and someone born a Jew can be an apostate, but they remain Jewish. Consequently, Reform Jews remain Jews, whether they're legitimate, whether the way in which they practice Judaism is legitimate is another question altogether. But also in light of what Adam said, you had people like Jack Wertheimer from JTS and elsewhere who wrote on this and feared this coming cataclysm, to quote Rabbi Bulka. And the reality is, by the time you get to 2010, it doesn't seem to have almost any impact at all on the nature of American Jewish life. And part of that is because the amount of intermarriage between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews in America comes to be, I think, fairly minuscule, not non-existent, but fairly minuscule. And I think from the standpoint of even many traditionalists in Reform, it was always believed that there could be a tikkun to all of this. That is to say, if an Orthodox Jewish youngster did fall in love with a Reform one who was patrilineally descended or non-lineally descended, more accurately in terms of the resolution, there could always be a conversion. It wasn't even like Mamze Root in this regard.
and I'm really taken by two articles in the Long Island Jewish World, which in the 1980s was very much the paper of record for American Judaism. All of the interesting people, the articles, and so what somebody should put it online. Two articles, one by Irving Yitz Greenberg, the Patrilineal Decision, a blow to Jewish unity, this concept of Jewish peoplehood, and how are we going to get together? How are we going to have one common conversation? Whereas you have the chief rabbi of Israel using unity in a different way. Chief rabbi urges, Rabbi Avraham Shapiro, urges greater unity in U.S. Orthodoxy because he's worried.
Exactly Adam's point.
Yes, exactly. And just what exactly, to be united with whom is very much called into question. Yeah.
Well, but also, Rabbi Greenberg, interestingly, is not willing to distinguish between the sociological and the religious legal definition. He is the ultimate, certainly Orthodox proponent of creating some sort of way for there to maintain unity. And the idea, which I think I'm trying to sort of segue to the later comments in the 21st century, the idea that it could be that Jews are unified in terms of peoplehood or in terms of some sort of sense of ethnic connection, however you want to describe it, while they're not even religiously, halachically of the same, status, something that Israel, did from the get-go, or certainly moved in that direction for various reasons. That's something that Rabbi Greenberg mourns. But eventually, kind of the Orthodox, they get around to that. That's where they get to. They might have hoped that some people would, that most people were still not patrilineal. They're also, but that's where it takes it. And if I may, the quote on the bottom, Rabbi Yaakov Perlo, that's the Novominsker Rav, who passed away just a few weeks ago. Yeah. He was a fascinating person. He was the heir to a Hasidic dynasty, but he also learned in Chaim Berlin in a Lithuanian yeshiva. They don't like to write on his biography. He also graduated from Brooklyn College, so he was kind of American.
And taught at the Hebrew Theological College.
And after that, and then he became the Rav of Breuers of the
yeshiva there
community in Washington Heights, before he became the president and the head of the Moetzes Gedolei Torah, the Council of Torah sages of Agudas Yisrael. And here I'm trying to remember that. Oh, is this 1999?
It's all in the 90s.
Yeah, 1999. I think this is his sense of the reform movement, and again, 16 years or a little bit more after patrilineal descent. And Zev, I'd love if you read this out loud, because I think it's a very important historical record here.
The following thoughts have been percolating in my mind the past few weeks. To some, they may seem novel. To some, even questionable. You see how his Brooklyn College comp classes contributed to his writing. It's very charismatic. But to me, they reflect an unquestionable reality. We are witness to a new stirring in the hearts of Jews that deserves our attention and reflection. The fact that this expression, this cry, has the official imprint of the reform movement is all the more astonishing given its ideological denial of revelation and sanctity of the Masorah, right, tradition. Is this the voice of the citadel of Kfira? No, this is the novel part. It is the voice of Jews lost in the wilderness. The Ma'aminim would be totally remiss in our understanding of Hashgacha were we to treat the publication of this manifesto with cynicism. The call to mitzvos should inherently lead to the caller and the followers, if they are serious seekers, to real tshuva return. The manifesto is therefore only a beginning, albeit a historic one.
Now, he doesn't deal with the technical side of it, but this statement says, I'm willing to overlook 1983, and I didn't go there. I didn't say the reform movement lost its status. It's not Christianity. It's not some sort of sect. These are Jews, and he certainly has a lot of critical things to say. He's not and he's sort of very patronizing. But having said that, this is a very different tone. And again, this is not a minor rabbi in Portland, Oregon, or something. This is the president and the head of the Council of Torah Sages of Israel. He was criticized. He had to defend himself. He got up. But here, it really raises the question of what was the meaning of a patrilineal dissent decision for the Orthodox in the long term.
Yeah, and the irony is that for the reform movement, even as it embraced these, even as it embraced patrilineality, and by the way, one of the great ironies is that even to this day, when I'm going to bet 70% of reform rabbis under certain conditions perform intermarriages, the 1973 resolution asking reform rabbis not to conduct intermarriage has never been reversed by the conference. It's an irony there, but the other irony is that Richard Levy, who had been a Hillel rabbi for many years at UCLA and later became head of the HUC Rabbinical School in Los Angeles until his death, that Rabbi Levy did issue a new Pittsburgh platform more than 100 years later in the 1990s from the original one, which is really quite traditional in its orientation. And this is what Rabbi Perlow is responding to.
What one esteemed professor once called the transition from a demonic deviant to a drowning brother. Right.
Very well. Look, the other point that I would make, and there is an article I read by Jack Wertheimer on this, that most of the Orthodox outreach groups in the United States leave aside the question of going into a Reformed temple, but most of them do accept non-halachic Jews in their outreach program in communities like Atlanta and elsewhere. Again, I'm sure, Adam, you and Zev can speak on this with much greater authority, but Wertheimer did write a piece on, oh, there you go.
Well,
boy,
David,
Zev.
I want to say something actually for a second, not about reform, but about conservative, and I'll say it in a very provocative way. For the kiruv movement, and even in Chabad, the downfall, or I wouldn't say downfall by any means, that's a mistake. The decline in the vibrance or the numbers of the conservative movement is very, very challenging, because the conservative movement has always been the main feeder for kiruv, for NCSY, to some degree later on, but certainly, maybe NCSY less, but certainly for the type of outreach done by Haredi groups, by Or Sameach. They understood at a certain point that if you want to find Jews, you find them in shul. And that's what the Atlanta Scholars Kollel is doing. And this was something that I, discovered at a certain point, and for me, it was mind-boggling to get to Atlanta, Georgia, find this group of all Ner Yisrael graduates. There were some Lakewood people there too, led by Menachem Deutsch, who's mentioned here, who go down to Atlanta, Georgia, and start this sort of what I call a Misnagdish Chabad house, where they learn in groups, and they're learning. It's different, but it's the same sort of idea. And what, David, you once said in Israel at a conference that I organized, you said that the Chabad house gave a place to go for Peter Berger's homeless mind. And in a sense, the community kollel did the same, and we're in the Chicago crowd. And I've done some research actually on the Chicago kollel, and I spent some time there a couple of years ago. And there's some fascinating thing. By the way, the Chicago kollel is the one that actually was instrumental in getting the psak that was also used here, which is to allow kiruv people to go into reform shuls.
This is the Wayu Kolel Torah Mitzion Kolel, not
No, the Chicago Haredi Kolel.
Oh, the Chicago Community Kolel.
Rabbi
Okay.
Zobin, I believe, and there are two rabbis who are the co-heads of it, with an H, I believe. Rabbi Kamenetsky's Mechutan, and Rabbi Kamenetsky's Tshuva, which was very controversial, allowing kiruv officers, workers, to go into non-Orthodox shuls to run beginner services and things. Actually, the source for that was in Chicago, and I have the text. But as you said here, here once again, the second paragraph here, whether you're Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, unaffiliated, or somewhere in between, your most vibrant source for Jewish learning is the Ask Kollel. Very, very snazzy, very attractive. And again, nobody's asking for labels anymore. I think here Chabad is a big factor.
And if we're just to understand the reception of it, the same line is used in Middlesex County, is used elsewhere. Which one is this? This is outside of Philadelphia. Here is Dallas.
Data.
Wow.
And then finally in Phoenix. So and it's a line. It's used throughout, the same exact language.
And these are all yeshivish Haredi kolos. These are not YU. In fact, I think YU would have a harder time with that language than the yeshivish, and that in itself is
Why is that? Why is that?
I think that for YU works more like the conservative reform movement work in terms of being a denominational, top-heavy, sort of top-down movement where sort of decisions are made as policy, and not everyone follows them, but in principle, there's a lot of institutional policy making and placement of jobs, affiliation, rabbinic alumni. There's a big structure. The Haredi world has a lot more room for independence, a lot more of a mara da'atra, that people do things in their place, or people have their rabbis. In this particular case, Rabbi Weinberg from Ner Yisrael was a pioneer in going in this direction, and then Rabbi Kamenetsky and his son in Philadelphia were also took a similar position. Again, there is debate about it, but the numbers in terms of, here we go back to sociology in terms of, or the demography, in terms of the increase in the sense of triumphalism within the American Haredi world is definitely a part of this self-confidence where they don't feel in competition. They don't feel like they feel they've won, and therefore they don't have to worry about going into these communities, whereas YU and seminary, JTS, and HUC to a certain degree were really in a head-on competition for years, and Rabbi Soloveitchik took very clear boundary marking positions on this issue. Certainly there are individual YU rabbis who are not taking that, but I think there's definitely a policy. And one more point is economics. Kiruv is a big cottage industry for the Haredi world. I mean, if you take, we've talked about this, I believe there are about 7,000 or 7,000 to 8,000 students learning full-time in Lakewood. Now, that means every year we could figure out how many of them are leaving, how many of them are going into Rabbanut in a Haredi shul, becoming teachers in schools, yeshivas, marrying wealthy families, working in computers, then going on to college. But if you're talking about numbers that great, people need to make a living. And going to a community kollel, an outreach kollel, where you can continue learning and doing something valuable is very powerful. But of course, like any economic thing that has an economic determinism, there's also has to be a sort of cognitive dissonance. You have to come up with an ideology that supports the change. So here you have this very interesting phenomenon where there's a triumphalism and there's a sort of an economic demand, but in the end of the day, it does lead to a change, and where you can make these statements like all Jews are Jews and we accept them all and we embrace them to a certain degree with boundaries. I don't want to make them seem pluralist. They are not pluralists, and they certainly have their boundaries. I wrote about that as well, but there's certainly, this is, to my mind at least, a major change in the way that you presented it through the patrilineal issue. Really, I think illuminates that change.
A lot about fluidity and boundaries. Yes, sorry, last word.
I mean, just one, again, another anecdote. For years, I used to teach in the summer at the Shalom Hartman Institute, and often did Shalot and Shuvot that dealt with issues of kiruv. And many of the responses, particularly by people like Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, certainly David Tzvi Hoffman and others, a number of the rabbis who attended, I'm talking now about Orthodox colleagues, were actually shocked to read Hoffman. It was Kimat Bilti Uman. They just couldn't believe it. But one of the rabbis I remember, who was an Orthodox rabbi in New Orleans, said that as he read Rabbi Hoffman's materials, he said he didn't quite know what to do. He said that here he was in New Orleans, and he said he knew lots of Reform and conservative Jews there who he said didn't have an halachic status as Jews. And he said it was his policy, he would not officiate at weddings when such people were involved unless they converted. But he said, you know, the problem is, he said, they are kind of Jewish. He said, they belong to synagogues, they go to synagogues, even if I think they're the wrong synagogues. They give money to Federation, they support Medinat Yisrael. And he said, I don't know quite what I'm going to do, but he said this literature was just interesting to me. But that's why I've often used the term to just say, for such a person, and I've used the term there, for such an Orthodox rabbi, such Jews are sociologically Jewish, but the reality is they're more than that. They're sort of culturally, religiously Jewish, even if they're kind of wrong in their approach. But it's as if the bifurcation between Jew and non-Jew, there is just this fluidity. And I noted on all the language that you pointed to, Zev, in those documents, I love the term, all the people in between. I mean, I guess the in between are many of these people, but what interested me was this Orthodox colleague, the fight he was having internally with how do I treat these people in my community who are clearly Jewish, but they're also not Jewish, and he wasn't quite sure what to do about it.
This was one of the ultimate ironies of the 1983 patrilineal decision, a decision which people either they were happy about it or despondent about it, that it would create categories. It would start to sort Jews into different boxes and create a certain level of rigidity, actually created a whole new set of questions and reinforced the concepts of fluidity, not just in American Judaism, but Jews all across the globe. That's one of the great,
Just one question, and neither of you could answer it for me. From an halachic standpoint, when Torah is taught in one of these kollels, how do these rabbis understand the halachic prohibition against teaching Torah, not Wissenschaft, but Torah to Gentiles? In other words, what is their, how do they legitimate this praxis? I mean, do you know? I'm asking. It actually makes me want to go back and look at Wertheimer again.
I think that's a wonderful question. I don't believe that Jack addressed that.
No.
I don't think so either.
It's a wonderful question, but it does assume that people take that prohibition seriously.
Well, Isaac Mann had a long article about it.
I'm not sure that that is the case. If I can just throw out that I actually have an article coming out in a volume in honor of Professor Schneur Lyman, in which Rabbi Henkin, Eliyahu Henkin, the early American 20th century or mid post-sec, sort of the predecessor of Rabbi Feinstein, or who was his colleague and debater in many ways, in one of his famous discussions of civil marriage, one of the reasons he's not willing to accept Rabbi Moshe's position that civil and reform marriage, the reform marriage has no meaning, is he says, because in the eyes of these people, the person performing the wedding is a rabbi. And they perceive him as a rabbi, so how can you say they don't see this as a religious ceremony? And so he actually, and he was very anti-reform, and he had some really very pejorative things to say about reform, but he actually thought that the perception of the Chatan and Kala could have implications for the halachic status of the union. So that's sort of blurriness, what you just said in New Orleans. That's
and the blurriness of what is Jewishness, a funny word in itself, might inform just why that question about whether or not one can teach Torah to Gentiles doesn't rise to the fore, because it's complicated.
Have you written on this, Zev?
I might now.
Oh, okay.
There is a lot to think about, a lot to digest, and a lot more, thank goodness, to write about. So there will still be jobs and work for us to do when the archives open, and there's more to do. In any case, I'm speaking to two of the most prolific, wonderful scholars, wonderful people that I have had the chance to talk with, and I so much enjoy every time I get to speak with Dr. David Ellenson, Dr. Adam Ferziger, and this is no exception. Thank you both so very much. This was absolutely delightful.
Thank you both. It was
Thank
great,
you for your
great
wonderful
honor.
hospitality, and it was great to see the two of you. Thank you.
I'll feed you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Be healthy.